Syria, long celebrated for its breathtaking beauty. For centuries, people of different faiths lived here side by side. Then in 2011, Syrians took to these streets to protest against decades of repressive rule. And Syria spiraled into one of the worst human disasters of our time.
You could call it smell of death, but it's smell of everything bad. It's smell of weapons and explosions.
I was shocked. A lot of foams coming out from their mouths. Their eyes ball are going smaller, and then they die.
This is the story of Syria's war, told by people who lived through it.
أنا بحس كل واحد بسوريا خسر بيت، خسر ابن.
Many times they forced me to listen to his voice while they were torturing him. Twice they forced me to watch.
Syria was under attack, and we have to defend ourselves.
The war drew in so many foreign powers, it stopped being just Syria's war.
It was chaotic, horrendous, catastrophic, an insult to the humanity of this planet.
I've never met a single person in the West who would answer my question: what happens next if Mr. Assad resigns?
I've been reporting from Syria throughout this most brutal war. What happened here? How did peaceful protests for change spiral into such unspeakable savagery? 500,000 people killed, millions of lives shattered, and so much of Syria in utter ruin.
I didn't tell any person that I'm going there, even my family. Before I left home, I had a look to faces of my mother and my father. I felt like it's the moment I'm saying goodbye. I was not sure, even I will be killed or arrested.
Noura Al-Jazawi, a 23-year-old university student. Everything she knew was about to change. She joined thousands who took to the streets of her city Homs, calling for political freedom.
It was an amazing day and special day. We feel like it's a miracle, it's not real.
Seldom had Syria witnessed scenes like this. Reports from the town of Deraa of teenagers tortured for spraying graffiti on a wall had lit a fuse.
I started shouting, "Free Syria, dignity, freedom. Syria is for us, not for Assad."
For years, Noura wrote a secret blog. Now, like others, she shouted in public.
It was my first time that I had a voice, so I exist.
But some Syrians felt threatened.
فتفاجأت بمظاهرة وكانت كبيرة اتجاه الحي تماما وخرجوا فاستنهضنا أهل الحي بأنهم يطلعوا فكانت صدمة طبعا للناس ولإلي أنا شخصيا.
Hayat Awad worked for a newspaper then in Homs. She started making notes on the protests.
تمزق صورة الرئيس، تنزل علم وطنك، تضرب بالحجرة جارك مشان شو؟ إذن هي تخريب وطن مو ثورة.
Protests flared in other places. And bloodshed too, as security forces moved to quell the uprising. The fervor of the Arab Spring of 2011 had now reached Syria.
I had visited Damascus and I had discussed with Assad, and he said that there would not be trouble in Syria and was quite passionate about it. So he, I believe, was very surprised by what started to happen.
2 weeks into the protests, President Assad went to Syria's parliament, cheered on by his supporters. His most anticipated speech after 11 years in power. He'd made some concessions. Now his advisors hinted he'd announce major reform.
الإصلاح هو ليس صرعة موسم. أعتقد التحدي الآن ما هو نوع الإصلاح الذي نريد أن نصل إليه. ولكن نحن بشر ولا يمكن أن نحب ما حصل، لا يمكن أن نحب الفتنة، لا يمكن أن نحب الدماء، فكل من يتورط فيها عن قصد أو عن غير قصد فهو يعمل على قتل وطنه.
The president blamed the protest on foreign plots and offered no reform. It only provoked more protests on the streets. And in some capitals, growing concern.
Bashar al-Assad went before Parliament and gave a very hardline speech that, rather than calming things down, ended up inflaming them more.
I view the whole journey in Syria as just one of tragic missed opportunity, missed calculation, none larger, of course, than Assad's own decisions when a peaceful series of protests about jobs and future was turned into the beginning of a civil war.
In Homs now, these streets were packed. Activists crowned this city the capital of the revolution.
People started to join from the whole city. I remember some of my friends joined us from Aleppo, others joined us from Damascus.
Protesters occupied this area around Homs Clock Tower, inspired by Egypt's Tahrir Square. Security forces were standing by. As night fell, they closed in, and organizers urged some to go home.
Between 11 and 12, they asked women and children to leave.
2 hours later, security forces moved in. Protesters called it the Clock Tower Massacre. Many died, the exact number disputed to this day, but it was a defining moment.
Actually, I was so afraid. It was a hard moment, but I felt like, for me at least, I cannot live as a normal person in this life. From this moment, I'm the daughter of revolution.
Two days before, in Homs, a Syrian general was murdered with his 2 sons and a nephew. Hayat blamed the opposition.
نزلوه من السيارة، قتلوه، مثلوا بجثته وجثة ابنه، أوضحت إن هي ما لها ثورة. لا. فكان الحي كله مزداق.
Hayat went to the funeral. This time, crowds supporting the government filled the streets. Just as the clock tower killings defined Noura, these deaths marked Hayat.
فأنا زعلت، ومن أثناءها هي كانت هي الدافع الأكبر لأنه أنا أخذ موقف وكون مع حكومتي ومع بلدي ومع الجيش.
From the very start of the uprising, there was a battle over what really happened.
From the first day of demonstration, we were a non-violence movement, and the regime was killing civilians.
They started immediately with violent demonstration.
But you saw what was happening in Homs, that the government started firing at protesters.
Everything was prepared for a confrontation. The weapons were stored. People had instructions from their operators, handlers.
The government says that there were armed protesters, and that's why they used force. Were there people among you who were armed, either with weapons or
Definitely no
rocks?
person who were holding weapons. This is the propaganda of regime at all.
As protests grew, the army was sent in to Dera, where the uprising started.
Within a couple of weeks, Syria was on a roller coaster. The government was simply shooting, trying to repress, rather than implement any kind of reforms. There were arrest sweeps where hundreds of people were detained. And that triggers even larger protests. By summer, we were in places like Hama and places like Homs. We were getting tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands.
Reporting from Damascus that year, we saw how the conflict escalated. Soldiers to the left.
Here we go.
Oh my goodness. The crackdown intensified. This teacher was stopped at a checkpoint in Homs, accused of inciting protests. His family later found his lifeless body, scarred by torture. Damascus, the seat of power, had seen few protests. The eyes of the secret police, the Mukhabarat, were everywhere in the capital.
I was just living a normal life as a young man in the middle of the capital, Damascus. Having my friends, going to parties.
Mohammed Abdallah, known as Artino, worked at a computer store in the city. He decided to join the protests growing on the outskirts of Damascus.
I was really scared because your adrenaline is like super high, but at the same time you feel like you're not alone in this. You can see the police are waiting for us, waiting for the order to attack us, to capture some of us.
The consequences of dissent could be terrible.
They put me in a cell, blindfolded me, and then a guy started to come and beat me, and then they moved me from one room to another room like that. It was between interrogation and torture. It was just like lay you on the floor and beat you. While you are sitting handcuffed to the chair, they could just beat you in the face, kick you, spit on you like that. They were insulting me to tell me like, you are an Alawi, you are from us, and you are like betrayed us.
Artino is Alawite, from the same Muslim minority sect as the president and many in power. He had a way out. His father had worked in military intelligence.
He told me, I paid a lot to get you out. Next time, I can't promise you. And my brother was in the military, so he sent me an SMS telling me like, I'd rather kill you with my own hands than let you destroy the family name.
This officer played a leading role in military operations around Damascus. He'd later become one of the most important generals in this war, General Mohammed Kadur.
تركنا المتظاهرين يهتفون بمطالب، حاولنا تقييد المظاهرات كي لا تمتد، لكن خلال عدة أسابيع فقط بدأت المتظاهرين إطلاق النار على الجيش
We've heard from so many young Syrian protesters who said that they were just calling for peaceful political change in Syria.
طبعا كذب، لأنه اللي بده يغير بعض الأمور في سوريا لا يحمل السلاح ويقتل الجيش ويقتل الشرطة ويقتل المدنيين. وأنا مصاب 3 مرات. هل المطالب السلمية هي من أصابتني في الرصاص؟
You were put on the Western sanctions list in which they talked about the suppression of peaceful protest. What was your reaction to being put on that list?
العقوبات عقوبات لا أساس لها من الصحة. أنا لم أقتل مدنيا، أنا ألقي القبض على من هو إرهابي ويمول الإرهاب وأسلمه إلى السلطات المختصة.
By the summer of 2011, people were taking up arms to fight back against the army.
When security personnel went into neighborhoods, they were met with gunfire. People on rooftops are shooting at the army, shooting at the police coming this way to slow them down while they tell the people, run that way.
The resistance became more organized. And then, the first armed opposition group was formed. A small group of Syrian officers had defected and launched what they called the Free Syrian Army. By now, the Syrian military's response was escalating. Tanks rolled into homes and opened fire. In Western capitals, growing pressure to do something and indecision over what to do. 6 months after protests began, Western leaders decided to ratchet up the rhetoric.
This morning, President Obama called on Assad to step aside. The transition to democracy in Syria has begun, and it's time for Assad to get out of the way.
Give lead you to believe that the U.S. would become involved in a significant way?
Of course, because as one of President Obama's security advisors said, superpowers don't bluff. You have to say what you mean, and you have to mean what you say.
I do think it was a mistake to call him and resign. It did create expectations, and I think that's I should have objected when I was called the night before.
Noura was now a leading figure in the opposition. She started an underground newspaper, working with other activists in Syria and abroad, knowing the risks they faced.
I keep asking myself that, how are we still alive? We know, all of us as protesters, we know that this way of revolution will take us even to jails or to death.
تحيا سوريا حرة. تحيا سوريا حتى.
We were losing our friends and our colleagues. Me, myself, I was in danger of detention or kidnapping. I had my coffee with my mother and I said goodbye. I went to the bus station. 4 guys. 2 of them were holding weapons. They said, come with us. They covered my eyes and they took me to a place, I don't know where this place is. I feel like I'm just swimming in the nothing and in the endless darkness.
So you were kept alone in a room, blindfolded?
Yeah.
For days?
Yeah. They were questioning me, and after that, forced me to keep awake for 4 days. In that moment, I had 8 friends who were detained by regime. And regime tried to force me to speak against them.
The guards singled out her friend Nawar.
Many times they forced me to listen to his voice while they were torturing him. They used many tools against detainees at that time.
So you heard the screams of your friend Nawar?
Yeah. And twice they forced me to watch.
Doctors, teachers, students ended up in prisons. Why was it necessary to arrest so many civilians?
We detain terrorists, we detain potential violators of law, as is the case in every country, but we don't detain civilians at large.
The tens of thousands went into prison, went into a black hole, and nobody knows if they're dead or alive.
We receive a lot of lists from the International Red Cross, but I really found out a lot of allegations where the government has no information about such people.
Noura was held in military prisons, including the infamous 215. Photos smuggled from this jail and others show victims numbered and recorded by a military police photographer.
This is an official government archive. This is a person from the military who was tasked to document, archive, index the numbers and names, and take pictures of dead bodies. These are not isolated cases. This is a state systematic campaign of torturing and abusing and killing people.
Calls to end this war echoed around the world. The UN came up with a plan for peace talks. It went nowhere. The West insisted any solution had to include President Assad's exit. But Syria's long-standing ally, Russia, resisted any suggestion of regime change.
The American approach towards Syria, they say this guy is bad and has to go away. While we do not take any position on that. We have never said that Mr. Assad is good and should stay. But in order to combat terror in a country, you need to have a functionable state. I've never met a single person in the West who would answer my question, what happens next if Mr. Assad resigns?
By the summer of 2012, the rebel Free Syrian Army was growing in numbers. Syrians from many walks of life were setting up local brigades to fight under the FSA banner. Alongside the Syrian officers who decided to defect.
غامرت وانشقيت عن هذا النظام، وبعد أسبوع تقريبا هربت أهلي تهريب وعائلتي إلى مكان آمن. يمكن هو كان أصعب قرار في حياتي، بس هو أسهل بكثير من أنه أكون أنا شريك للنظام المجرم في قتل الشعب.
The rebels now set their sights on Aleppo, an ancient city, Syria's industrial heartland, a bastion still of government support. Colonel O'Cady led FSA fighters, along with militia formed just the day before they launched a sudden attack.
دخلنا بأقل حوالي 400 مقاتل تقريبا. دخلنا حلب ولم يكن بحوزتنا سوى بوريد الكلاشنكوف وبعض قواذف الار بي جي وربما رشاش بكيسي لا يتجاوز 5 رشاشات. يعني لا أدري حينها كنا شجعان إلى درجة كبيرة أم كنا مجانين متهورين أن نقتحم دبابات النظام ببواريد كلاشينكوف.
I remember very well in 2012 bets inside the State Department about how long Assad would last. And the betting was it was either going to be by Thanksgiving 2012 or Christmas. That's how sure we were that the Free Syrian Army, which we were supporting, was going to get the upper hand and win.
But in Aleppo, the army mobilized. The rebels' stunning assault stalled. The fighters managed to hold on to about half of Aleppo, but their weaknesses were exposed.
What's so-called today Free Syrian Army is not an army. I was officer in an army, and I know what is an army. It is not an army. There's no discipline, no military training, no experience. When we get some progress on the ground, we didn't get after that any ammunition for more than 1 month.
The US was weighing up how much support to give the rebels. The CIA was already on the ground, mainly in Turkey, monitoring the arms and cash entering Syria from supporters in Arab states. Now the CIA came up with a plan to vet, train, and arm the rebels themselves.
It was a government that was really under siege, including in the capital city itself. There are never any guarantees, and I think the debates of that time all reflected that. The question was, again, how serious was the president when he said Bashar al-Assad must go?
But the president's team was divided. He and some key advisors weren't convinced the CIA plan would work.
President Obama would always ask, well, how is that actually going to fix the problem that we're talking about here? And then everyone sort of looked at their shoes and said, well, that won't stop it. And he said, well, then why the hell are we talking about it if this is not going to solve the actual problem? We're not doing this just to make ourselves feel good.
The Obama administration was very, very reluctant to provide weapons to the opposition, and meanwhile, people were being slaughtered without the ability to defend themselves.
This is when you decided that you had to get involved by financing, providing arms for the opposition?
We finally came to the point where we and a number of countries said we would rather do it with you. If not, we will do it alone.
President Obama was reluctant to be drawn into another war in the Middle East, but he did lay down a red line on chemical weapons.
I have, at this point, not ordered military engagement, but a red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus. Thank you.
She was the voice of every oppressed human being fighting for their freedom. For the sake of better future for all of us.
We will not be silent!
We demand the immediate release of the human rights activist Noura al-Jizawi.
She was abducted by the...
An international campaign was launched to free the activist Noura. She was moved from a military prison to a civilian one.
It was easier because there, at least my family knew where I am, and they succeeded to use corruption and to pay.
So you think your family paid money?
Absolutely, they paid money.
In September 2012, the Syria Noura stepped back into after 7 months had changed.
I felt like I missed a huge gap. I couldn't understand. We had armed group with the black flags and how we have less demonstrations, and tens of activists who I started working with them in the beginning they had been arrested or disappeared.
More radical Islamists were entering the fray. Conservative Muslim groups were already fighting under the FSA banner. Now, hardline fighters like this were forming their own alliances. Some would later be linked to Al-Qaeda. Some new groups were led by Islamists freed from prison in a presidential pardon just after protests began. Some saw it as a concession, others a cynical step by the government.
Their argument to the world is, we are the protectors of secularism in Syria, and here you go. They released these prisoners during the revolution, knowing fully that these extremists, when allowed to flourish, will fill in the vacuum.
And secret supply chains were smuggling weapons and money into Syria. By this time, the biggest financial backer of the opposition was the wealthy Gulf state of Qatar. And some of its money was ending up in the hands of hardline Islamists.
We wanted to empower the Free Syrian Army, but also we want to support groups from Islamic backgrounds. You cannot exclude them since they are Syrian and they are defending the same cause.
So this was groups, for example, Jabhat al-Nusra, which is linked to Al-Qaeda. Qatar is known to have backed them in the early stages. Did you realize at some point it was not a good idea?
When they formed themselves, they were an Islamic Syrian groups as the other Islamic Syrian groups.
But linked very early on to Al-Qaeda.
When they formed themselves as Jabhat al-Nusra and pledged the allegiance for Al-Qaeda, everybody would hold the support from that.
Syria's uprising was now a fully fledged war. The city of Homs, which saw some of the first and biggest protests, had by now suffered some of the worst fighting. Such a chilling feeling. Homs was a vibrant third city of Syria. Parts were in rebel hands. The battles left neighborhoods in ruin, tens of thousands forced to flee. In other areas, some chose to stay.
You have to imagine a background of smoke and then the sound, hear the takeoff. Then you hear the landing of the mortars. As if some kind of big, ugly giant stepping on the city.
Marwa al-Subuni, an architect and author, lived with her young family close to the front line.
My son was traumatized by the noises. He couldn't control his fear. Just, you know, he's get really scared and he will block his ears and couldn't bear it. Everybody's technique was to create this safe bubble where you just play them songs, read for them, keep them occupied and loved. And just, you know, smell of, you could call it smell of death, but it's smell of everything bad. It's smell of weapons and explosions and this kind of image, which was the worst.
By the end of 2012 in Homs, the Syrian army controlled most of the city. A few significant pockets were still in rebel hands. Homs had become a city of snipers. Hayat Awad lived in a neighborhood staunchly supporting the government. Her husband was in the military and 2 of her 3 sons. Often out filming with the army, often in the sights of rebel snipers.
أثناء اللي بدنا ننتقل من شارع لشارع ما كان في مجال لأنه كان القناص حاكم هذا الشارع. استغليت فرصة أنه هو شوي خف الخنص وطلعت بأثناءها. حسيت بالطلقة عم تطلع ولكن كانت طلقة متفجرة من قناص فوقعت على الأرض.
Months later, she came across the corpse of a rebel sniper. What she did next came as a shock, even to herself.
كتير كان في عندي نوع من الحنق على هذا الشخص اللي كان يقوس على المرأة، على الطفل، على الكذا بحي. فأنا كتير كنت مزعوجة وبنفس الوقت كنت مبسوطة إنه ارتحنا منه، إنه الجيش خلصنا منه.
عليك يا كلب.
Did it surprise you that you did that?
إيه. تفاجأت بحالي إنه الأحداث اللي مرينا فيها نسبة المدنيين، الأصدقاء، الجيران اللي فقدتهم يمكن هو دفعني وعطاني الجرأة بإنه أتصرف في هاي التصرف.
Syrian warplanes ruled the skies, shelling rebel areas, including Hom's old city. The ancient quarter became a byword for a tactic used time and again in this war: siege and starvation.
هلا هون تحت في حدا. هون بس حد هون راس الشارع. جيش.
مدينة أشباح رعب كانت بس. بس عن أصوات رصاص كانت تحمص.
Mohammed Jiniata left his military service to join the rebels. Several thousand civilians were also trapped inside the besieged quarter.
والأكل طبعا ما في، دواء ما في، كان موجود شوية برغل عديس. اضطرينا نلجأ لأوراق الأشجار. إنه هاي الشجرة صارت مثل طعم، بيجوا عليها الناس فيحط قناص عندها. كثير ناس ماتت في هذا الوقت، هيك يعني شكل. بحدود 800-900 عائلة كان موجود، فيهم نسوان وفيهم أطفال. وحتى وصلنا لمرحلة إنه الشباب كثير نزل وزنها بشكل رهيب. يعني الشاب عمره 25 26 سنة الأسوار النسوان بتفوت من رجله إلى فخذه.
In the West, the clamor to intervene was growing ever stronger. General David Richards headed the British Armed Forces.
The Western liberal response, a sort of Pavlovian reaction to these things, is to go and support them. It was bad man, good people, didn't really count how many, we've got to go and help them. We started looking at options which ranged from Iraq-style full intervention through a training commitment through to what we ended up doing, which was minimalist.
Syria's savage war soon spread far beyond the battlefield. By early 2013, not a month went by without a massacre of civilians somewhere. We heard terrible reports coming from Syria, a village just outside Homs. We traveled there and convinced the army to take us in. And what we found was shocking. There's blood on the cement, and a body is straddling the doorway, and one sprawled in the yard in positions which suggest they were trying to flee. The family who lived here was shot and burned alive. The bottle of fuel still here. Oh, inside this compound, a trail of blood. Bodies were dragged away. And around the back, more bodies. A woman, completely charred, in her bed. More than 100 men, women and children were slaughtered. Soldiers blamed it on Islamist rebels. The villagers were too afraid to speak. Only now do survivors who've left feel able to talk.
أول شيء بأن أيام جيش العالم صارت تعيط إنه إجت شبيحة وما إجت شبيحة. هون خفت على أولادي. حاطين الناس حاطة شرايط خضر على إيديها. في منهم لابسين بيجامات رياضة. هون عرفت إنه ما نجيش.
She speaks of a feared militia known as Shabiha, armed gangs fiercely loyal to the regime, mainly from the Alawite sect.
حبسونا ببيتهم قاعد فاتوا على الحصوية. القريب الساعة 1:30. خف الصوت برا شوي. طلعت اركض ولا جيران الدخان عم تطلع من دارهم وصوت ولاويل. فت على جيراننا هيك عم يحترقوا نسوان واطفال كلياتهم. وقت صرنا نطفيهم هيك كأنا عم طفيهم قمت دست بجثة الطفل.
Another man searched desperately for his uncle.
شفت دخان عم تطلع من البيوت وفي ريحة. حكي مرته وبناته حارقينه حرق وهو عايش.
A massacre like this on a Sunni Muslim village was seen as sectarian.
What Assad did very well from the beginning, painting what's happening as a Sunni threat to the Alawis, and telling the Alawis, you have to defend yourselves. And to do that, you have to get brutal, and we're going to use these groups. And these groups were let alone and acted at their own. These atrocities happen from both sides, but you will find people who will justify these acts.
Syria's army was under mounting strain. Deaths, desertions, defections were taking their toll. In this loyal heartland in the western mountains, villagers were burying their dead every day. Soldiers killed on front lines.
أنا بحس كل واحد بسوريا خسر بيت، خسر ابن.
Hayat's 21-year-old son Mahmoud was also in the army. During a fierce battle at a hospital, his unit was encircled by fighters linked to Al-Qaeda.
استشهد محمود مع رفقاته لأنه هجموا على المشفى بعدين فجروا للمشفى كاملا.
After her son's death, Hayat decided to work for the Ministry of Information.
فهذا اليوم هو ذكرى أليمة بحياتي استشهاد محمود.
By the beginning of 2013, warring sides were locked in a bloody stalemate. The Syrian army was now stretched across many fronts. And the US saw a chance to force President Assad to the negotiating table.
I came in 2013 and we found a fairly weak Assad, and that's when I sort of sensed we had to create the leverage in order to be able to get to the discussion.
But the president remained defiant, denouncing rebels as Western puppets. His powerful allies, Russia and Iran, stood firmly behind him.
We have always supported efforts made by the United Nations. What we have always been concerned about was this double game played by our Western partners, because they would support certain moves in terms of the political settlement in Syria, but on the other hand, they would always support weaponed, armed opposition fighting against Mr. Assad.
And now Iran stepped up its game. Its advisors had been in Syria from the start. Now Lebanon's Hezbollah militia, backed by Tehran, joined the battle on a key front line.
ونحن مصيرنا مشترك وهم مقاتلين شجعان ويمتازون بالتخطيط والتنفيذ للمعارك بشكل صحيح وسليم.
A few thousand Hezbollah fighters, well-armed, well-trained, reinforced the Syrian army. The mission? To retake Qusair, a strategic border town on key supply routes. They surrounded and pounded the rebel forces controlling the town. FSA commander Colonel O'Cady set off with just 300 fighters to relieve his beleaguered comrades.
الآن جايينك يا بشار سندق حصونك إن شاء الله في الضاحية بإذن الله.
Colonel O'Cady's men battled their way into Qusair and found scenes of utter devastation.
حوالي 1200 جريح موجودين في القصير، لا يوجد مستشفيات، لا يوجد دواء، وكثير منهم مات لأنه لا يوجد أي علاج، لا يوجد فيها طعام، لا يوجد فيها ماء، لا يوجد فيها خبز، لا يوجد فيها وقود. النظام يحاصرها من كل الجهات.
In the end, the colonel and his exhausted men pulled out on foot, carrying as many wounded as they could. Once a symbol of rebel resistance, Qusair was now a symbol of retreat. We drove into the town just hours after the Syrian army claimed victory.
The city lies in ruin. The troops are everywhere. They've retaken Qusair.
Hezbollah fighters didn't hide their role in the victory.
The arrival of Hezbollah, that was the turning point. And I remember General Idris saying, everything has changed. We could beat the Syrian army. Their hearts are not in this. They're not well prepared. It has all changed because the commanders now are Hezbollah.
The war entered a new phase. Iran's growing sway in Syria alarmed its rivals in the region.
The Iranians mobilized militias out of Iraq, Shia militias, and out of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so this ended up intensifying the war there.
Would you say that your main concern in Syria evolved not into worrying about President Assad, but worrying about Iran's growing influence?
Well, Iran's growing influence in Syria is a function of Bashar al-Assad. He's the one who opened the country to them.
Syria's war grew ever more tangled, the human cost ever worse. By the summer of 2013, 2 million Syrians had fled their country. 4 million more displaced inside.
It was the worst of all worlds. We were doing just enough to keep the thing alive as a conflict, hundreds of thousands dying, millions beginning to be displaced, and we seemed to think that was okay. And I'm reluctant to call it a strategy, but I'll grace it with that term. The strategy we were applying in a way was quite clearly not working, and our judgment was it wasn't going to work. And it was at that point I said in exasperation, look, if it goes on like this, I mean, people are dying in their tens of thousands. You know, it might be better, just better to think about it, to let Assad win and put an end to all this. And of course, that was complete no-no.
The center of the capital, Damascus, was still in government hands, but rebel groups were advancing from the outskirts. And some of the heaviest fighting in this city since the uprising began. By now,
Now Artino was a photographer in the rebel enclave of Ghouta on the edge of the capital. One summer's night, he heard reports of a major attack.
It was crazy because everyone's running and people just keep coming. At that time, we didn't know what's going on. People are just like a lot of foams coming out from their mouth. Their eyes ball are going smaller and then they die. And then I moved to the hospital. I saw a lot of bodies. Most of them are children. I still remember it, laying on the floor.
Artino filmed the unfolding tragedy.
I see them as children who are sleeping. Their eyes are closed, and they were wearing their pajamas. When I realized that they were not sleeping, it was a big shock for me. My camera fell down of my hand, and I started crying and shaking because I couldn't handle the situation. And I started to take pictures, and I felt like I'm going dizzy, and my eyes were really going small. And then I went down.
So you were also affected by the gas?
I was affected by the gas. But I was lucky enough that I was next to the doctor. So he gave me atropine. I just like woke up. I couldn't breathe, like cuts, you know, inside my throat. And my eyes were really hurting. I barely could like really open my eyes. The doctor told me that this is all evidence of a sarin attack or a sarin gas.
Hundreds of people died. Thousands were affected by the nerve agent sarin. The finger of blame pointed at Syria's government. They and their allies accused the rebels.
Some would say it wouldn't make sense for the rebels to use poison gases in their own areas, where people, their families, where they live.
These are criminals. They use them against their own people to say, look, the government is using them. We have never used chemical weapons even against terrorists.
I'm absolutely sure that the authorities of Syria do not have any motivation, do not have any interest of using chemical weapons against opposition.
Intelligence indicated the Syrian government had crossed President Obama's red line.
This kind of attack is a challenge to the world. We cannot accept a world where women and children and innocent civilians are gassed on a terrible scale.
Prime Minister David Cameron was one of the first to call for a military response. He rushed to seek parliamentary approval.
We were blindsided. We did not know that the Prime Minister was going to go to the Parliament.
He was surprised when I told him that we were going to do that. But that is, in effect, the British Constitution. So this shouldn't have been a surprise for the United States, given they have a large embassy here that knows how British politics works.
The ayes to the right, 272. The noes to the left, 285.
We certainly were surprised that once the Prime Minister had made the decision to go, that he lost the vote.
Have you lost control, Prime Minister?
Well, that had a profound impact, and the questions began to come at us, oh, aren't you going to come to Congress?
The world waited to see how President Obama would react to this most brutal chemical attack in decades.
We bought a fuel, we borrowed a generator, we bought a TV. I think it was more than 20 to 30 people sitting in one room.
My fellow Americans, tonight I want to talk to you about Syria.
We were hoping that action could stop and make a point and make a big statement to the regime like enough is enough.
we know the Assad regime was responsible. However, over the last few days, we've seen some encouraging signs. I have therefore asked the leaders of Congress to postpone a vote to authorize the use of force while we pursue this diplomatic path.
We were like, no way. We were like, that's not possible. Did he just said that he's not going to do anything? We felt hopeless and we felt left behind.
Do you remember the moment?
I slept peacefully. They expected President Obama to bombard Syria. I went to bed and slept until late in the day.
And why?
Because I knew that he will not dare do such a thing.
I was in Washington. We were stunned because everything was in place. We were talking to them about providing support, and I think everybody was surprised that the president did not respect the red line that he drew a year earlier.
It was an opportunity for everybody to stand united and to protect the civilian in Syria. I think it was a turning point for everything.
But Washington was already talking to Moscow about a different way forward.
When I was asked, is there anything that Assad could do to avoid being bombed, I answered yes, he could remove the chemical weapons from Syria. And within hours, Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia and I were engaged in a discussion.
A deal was struck. UN inspectors oversaw the destruction of Syria's declared chemical arsenal.
We removed 1,300 tons of chemical weapons, all the declared weapons. And President Obama accomplished the goal that he had set out to do. And I think it's incredible that people say, oh, you should have bombed him anyway, and maybe gotten a lot less. I mean, frankly, that's just plain stupid.
The policy was a failure. When the red line incident came and went, I think we hoped for a moment that maybe Assad would respect the norms, respect the deal. But we got within just a month or two, we got reports that he was using chlorine gas again. So we hadn't gone very far at all.
I thought a line had been crossed where we had to take action. After that point, we had almost no influence over the Syrian crisis. It was as if we had walked away from it and slammed a door and said, you can do what you want. You can kill as many people as you like with any weapons you like. There's nothing you can do to provoke us.
Gulf states and Turkey lost patience with the West. Now more than ever, they were ready to back whichever militias seemed to stand the best chance of ousting the Syrian leader.
It was self-help. People decided, okay, we're going to take this into our own hands, and they began to make choices about who was getting support and how. That was not helpful, and had huge consequence, no question about it.
It was a war against Syria created by the intelligence circles in the West against the Syrian people. They did not care for Syrian lives. They will pay for that.
Next time, the rise of extremism. And the human cost of this war.
I start to say some praise, God, please protect us.
We're back here tomorrow night, same time, to conclude this two-part series.